Welcome. Welcome to the United States of America. A lot of you, I think, are farmers, right? When you have quality seeds, you can put them in foreign soil and they will blossom, they will bloom. And we are excited to welcome you here to our country where we think you will bloom, and we will hopefully allow you to have fulfilling lives for your children, and then we will benefit alongside you.
So today, the Department of State posted on Twitter, today we welcome the first group of Afrikaner refugees fleeing persecution from their native South Africa. We stand with these refugees, many of them farmers and former business owners, as they build a better future for themselves and their children here in the US. So what is crazy about being a YouTuber for so long is making videos where you cover stuff as like fringe fascist conspiracy theories, and then years later the most powerful government on earth is then basing its policy on these fringe fascist conspiracy theories. And of course, with the richest man in the world, the most powerful man in the world, who's the de facto shadow president, Elon Musk, who is South African himself, obviously having a huge influence in this. And now, if you haven't seen, he's using his AI linked to Twitter, Grok, to actually spam loads of misinformation and just generally muddy the water around the issue of white farmers in South Africa. And today we're going to talk about like a lot of these issues. I'm going to give you the general landscape of like land reform and how the targeting and killing of white farmers by the government based on like some sort of discriminatory policy was a myth in 2021, was a myth in 2018 when people like Lauren Southern made those documentaries, and is still a myth today. And these white Afrikaners going to the US claiming persecution by the government based on their identity obviously are full of shit. But again, it's a Nazi conspiracy theory pushed by people in South Africa, obviously got the ear of Elon Musk, who's now brought that into the halls of power. To be fair, I will say Donald Trump did kind of talk about this in 2018 when it first became news, but didn't really make much progress. But now we're seeing that lots of these people are going to the US. And obviously we can't ignore that a lot of the US government's targeting of the South African government and calling them racist and shit like that is also because of their actions in regard to Israel and Palestine. So all of that coming up for you today. Before we go any further, my girlfriend is running a half marathon this week. We are raising money for medical aid for Palestinians. We've raised so much already, but please, if you haven't, consider donating. And let's push in the final week to get as much money as possible raised for medical aid for Palestinians. Thank you so much to everyone who's donated to this and or has donated to a previous fundraiser I did for this same organization. So before we get into just the unhinged like propaganda around this issue, let me just give you the broad overview. So basically, this white farmers myth has been pushed by the alt-right in Europe and in South Africa since about 2018. Lauren Southern made a whole documentary on it. It was also pushed by Stefan Molyneux.
But at least a few of the right-wing outlets said, maybe there's something wrong going on here. Maybe there's something a little off. And every day that we ignore this more, the crisis gets worse. And these people, we hear the people over there screaming, refugees are welcome. For some reason, they're never talking about the white South Africans. For some reason, they're never talking about the Boer. Despite the fact that the Boer people are some of the most resourceful, hardworking, amazing people I have ever met in my life. They love their culture. They love their families. They love their freedoms. And I understand why so many of them, they don't want to leave. They want to protect that. They want to preserve that. The land they are on is not stolen. And anyone who knows the history of South Africa knows that to be a fact.
And like I said, Donald Trump did talk about this in 2018, but seemed to not care too much going forward. But basically what's happened this year is the South African government signed a new law around land reform, which allows the government to expropriate land, and in rare cases without compensation. And this has reignited a lot of this propaganda. And basically, for those of you who don't know, you probably do, South African farmland is still very disproportionately owned by a minority of the population. And obviously this is the white minority that grabbed this land during British colonial rule and obviously during independent apartheid South Africa. Now, as we saw in Rhodesia in 1980, Robert Mugabe and people who made up the new government seized the land, right? And they seized the land without compensation. And basically what happened in South Africa is the white minority were fearful this same thing would happen. Now, people like Nelson Mandela, who was a socialist, he did want to take a more militant stance towards this. He did actually want to radically readdress this, maybe not exactly in the same way as Zimbabwe, but he did want to make sure that the farmland wasn't disproportionately owned by the white minority. He wanted to do something in line with what the government are saying now. He did just want to take the farmland back. But sadly for Mandela, what happened is he was in prison for such a long time that when he came out, the world had radically changed. There was no communist bloc anymore, and people were just not sympathetic to these radical politics as much. And South Africa now, the new South Africa, would have to rely on the West for support, as well as the anti-apartheid movement's traditional allies in like socialist countries. So basically, as a concession, the ANC didn't really pursue any sort of radical land reform program. So what happened is, and part of the reason South Africa is still a mess today in terms of racial inequality, that the disproportionate ownership of land by the white minority was never significantly addressed. And even still today, I think it's about like 70% of this land is still owned by this white minority. And this act recently is just like a step they're taking to try and push this process even further, because this issue has essentially been in limbo since the end of apartheid. Now, of course, now, because there is a law that says you can take this land without compensation, this is why it's gone into overdrive of the US government. And in February, they actually announced this program that they are going to have this settlement program for Afrikaner refugees fleeing persecution, because again, they have pushed the myth that all of this is based on racial discrimination. So that's the general overview for you. And also going along with the post-apartheid period, killings of farmers has drastically decreased since the post-apartheid period. It's basically stabilized, and there's really no evidence there's an uptick in racially motivated killing in terms of one of the many black ethnic groups killing white farmers out of some sort of prejudice against their like white skin, or even trying to address some historic grievance and stuff. It just simply isn't happening. It's a fantasy pushed by Nazis. And let's get into that now, because of course, I showed you the video of these Afrikaner refugees. So Trump said this week, you people don't want to write about it. It's a terrible thing that's taken place and farmers are being killed. They happen to be white, but whether they are white or black makes no difference. I'm sure I believe him. Trump also said that while he's expected to meet with the South African leadership next week, he doesn't know if he can attend unless the situation is taken care of, seemingly referring to Afrikaners' claims of ongoing discrimination. Also this week, White House spokesperson Anna Kelly said that the South African government have been supporting terrorist and autocratic regimes at face value over the tragic persecution claims of Afrikaners. President Trump is offering needed assistance to resettle persecuted minorities in South Africa because of a commitment to human rights is central to the America First agenda. Obviously, people say 1984 for so much stuff, but I think that is like the perfect encapsulation. Like, a fascist regime in America that is trying to be autocratic and supports autocratic regimes around the world and supports the most disgusting human rights abuses this century, are now accusing another country of doing that while claiming that it stands up for human rights. It's just so funny, but of course they're doing this in part in response to South Africa's stance on Palestine. Can't ignore that a lot of this story is probably facilitated by Elon Musk. Like, the difference between Donald Trump acting on this in 2018 and 2025 is Palestine, but also Elon Musk's involvement in the government. So I don't even know what this is about. He's changed his name to Gorkland Rust. So funny. I don't know what that picture is either. But he's been reposting a lot of stuff. They've been focusing mainly on Julius Malema. And obviously, you've probably seen these chants. He's been leading these kill the Boer chants. And everyone's just been posting it to justify why white Afrikaners are apparently a persecuted minority. There was another thing where the white Afrikaners put loads of crosses in a place in South Africa, and someone tweeting, each cross represents a white farmer who was murdered in South Africa, which is just easily debunked because there are so many crosses. And even if you take the totality of farmers killed, I don't think it reaches that much. And it definitely isn't the number of white farmers who have died in the last 30 years, for sure. But Elon Musk writes so many crosses, so just boosting this Nazi propaganda. But now here's the most dystopian thing, is Matt Binder pointed this out. He said, very weird thing happening with Grok. Elon Musk's AI chatbot can't stop talking about South Africa and is replying to completely unrelated tweets on here, talking about white genocide and kill the Boer. Like, here's a tweet about like something called a strawberry elephant, and someone saying, Grok, is this real? And then Grok starts saying, for some reason, it answers the question, then said, regarding South Africa, Kill the Boer is a controversial anti-apartheid song. Some see it as historical, some as insightful. Courts are split with no clear evidence linking it to violence. So what is the weird thing about this Grok answer is it's obviously basing it on actual news articles. Like, it's not Elon Musk actually writing the answer in there, but it constantly keeps bringing this up. So it's clear this is being trained on actual like factual information. So when it's bringing this up, it can't actually say that, yeah, like this neo-Nazi myth is actually true. But I still think the point of this and the reason it's doing this is it's still boosting this in the algorithm, right? So if Grok keeps writing kill the Boer, then what's going to keep happening is you're going to be directed to right-wingers tweeting the video of that politician saying that, and then that obviously helps the US propaganda of, well, this guy is saying it, and Trump is saying they're being killed for their white identity, so clearly this is actually happening. So this is how this misinformation is spreading, but it's actually wild. This chatbot is just writing this under so many tweets that are completely irrelevant. There's a subreddit called A Boring Dystopia, and that just sums up this dystopia so perfectly. Like, so many of us love dystopian fiction, cyberpunk, Blade Runner, but there's like a silver lining of some things look cool. Where now it's like, no, everything looks the same. It's just everything like under the surface is hell now and just completely disgusting and seems designed to turn the West into a complete fascist hellscape. So yeah, Elon Musk, Grok and Trump accepting all these African refugees because of false claims they are being persecuted for their identity must be one of the most insane things when white farmers overwhelmingly and disproportionately own most of the farmland still. But there's a myth that the government is systematically exterminating them for their identity. Where I'd say the reason the EEF are even popular is because the government never addressed the issue of land reform in the first place, which has contributed to South Africa being this unequal society where white people on average have a far better life than black people in South Africa. But I went on the South Africa subreddit to obviously get more of an insight, and I found some interesting comments about this because I don't know the intricacies of like South African identity or politics. I am friends with two white South Africans. One's half South African. One moved here recently. I'll tell a funny anecdote though. The one thing that South Africans aren't generally beating, that white South Africans are far more racist than most white people. So this is just a funny story. So my white South African friend, he's not racist. We've actually had good conversations about South African politics. He did grow up there. He lived there. He did say, you know, he loves it, but it is like insanely dangerous. We got the train to football and we got the train to this place called Wimbledon, which you might know from the tennis and stuff. So we get off the train and I'm surprised at how much South African stuff I'm seeing. And there's like some South African food stand. And we're just walking. He goes, "Oh, I'm gonna go buy something from this. There's like maybe some South African drink, and is it biltong, which is like the jerky?" So he goes, he starts talking to the guy because obviously the guy probably heard his accent. He's like, you know, you're South African as well. So they're talking like 5 minutes. He walks away, and I go, "Oh, like," I was like, "Oh, you from the same place or something?" And I asked him what he was talking about, and he's like, "Yeah, just talking about a few things." He was really racist though, and I was like, how did that even come up? And he's like, he was talking about like why he moved here to get away from like basically black people. And I was like, holy shit, like how did you talk to a complete stranger? And he felt comfortable in a complete different country offering up that information. I was just one of those stories where it's like, yeah, like these people have such a bad reputation for this stuff and they're just not beating it. I will say one more thing actually. My links to South Africa, just before we get to the rest of the comments, small tangent, is I got told like growing up that one of my either like great granddads or great grandads, he fought in the Boer War in South Africa, which was like the British Empire fighting like these African independence movements, right? And I always assumed that mean he fought for the British Empire. One of my relatives told me recently, like, no, he didn't fight for the British Empire. The IRB sent Irish people over there to get practice in fighting the British. So my great granddad actually fought on the side of the Boers during the Second Boer War, which I thought was like really interesting.
Hey, bro, welcome to Durban. I'm Jan de Toit. Have you been surfing much today? The waves are so up today, man.
I'm Trevor Stonteltown. I work in mining in Perth.
Hello, guy. My name is Bill Dong. Yeah, I work the shark dives in town.
Let's go out this weekend. There'll be a ton of chicks. We can just hang out, have a good time, and let go a little.
No, fuck that.
Stop right there. Adrian de Boerwurst. What are you doing on my front lawn? You know that it stops right here. Unless you're here to play rugby with me today, then get out, please.
It just shows you how like weird the politics were at the time. I guess it explains partly why even like a lot of leftist Irish Republicans supported early socialist Zionism as well, because they just hated the British so much and the general European racism. They didn't think too much about the actual African natives or the Palestinians in this era. So they didn't even see the hypocrisy of really going over to South Africa to fight for the settlers against the British Empire. It was like a really weird dynamic. I guess they're just so motivated by being anti-British. Maybe they didn't give a shit, but that's another funny link I have to South Africa. So now let's just read some responses in the South African subreddit to this story, and I think a lot of them are enlightening. So there was a good article, I'm going to read you a little bit of it later, and the title was "Let's Not Call These Afrikaners Refugees, They're Background Extras in MAGA's Noisy Scam." And someone just said, "Great piece," and quoted, "Afrikaans culture is rich and beautiful. At its worst, however, it is shot through with a woe is me messianic streak that does it no favours." And the commenter saying, "As an Afrikaner, this is a great description of our culture. The narrative of Die Volk, God's chosen, still runs deep in some Afrikaners, unfortunately. It's like we're sulking, scolded children who can't accept the reality that what we did was absolutely wrong and that our actions have consequences, and that maturing as a people group will involve facing those consequences, but we can't even get past the starting point of apartheid equals bad." 100% agree with you. The biggest issue in the majority in Afrikaner communities is the complete lack of self-awareness and introspection. A simple understanding and acknowledgement of what black South Africans went through during apartheid and the very real legacies that still exist would go a long way, as well as just acknowledging that the average black South African would need to work harder to get where the average white South African would be. So this is one good comment as well, because it shows that radicalization of just different communities isn't just related to America and Britain. It's not just like white Americans and white English people getting radicalized by Twitter. So one says, "I personally know someone who's shooting for this refugee cack, like 100% on board with it, applying and everything. About as Afrikaans as scones and cream too. I genuinely cannot fathom it. I never saw it coming. One moment they are normal, next thing I know, they're harping on about white genocide and telling me I should just ask questions. Full on and rapidly gaining traction. Musk is a genius who has saved the world. America will liberate the earth. Trump is the best. I'm talking weeks too. And tons of ours by the watering hole are the same. But that doesn't surprise me. I'm not being funny, but they are doff as fuck. And it always seems to be the really doff ones that assimilate with the whole thing. But by fuck, the change happened so fast and all of a sudden, there is no talking sense either, wildest claims." And that story he just told, I bet like everyone can relate to that across the West. Like you probably know someone who might have even have grown up in like a majority white place, and then suddenly they become radicalized by Twitter and they're banging on about like a Muslim invasion. Like that's what happens in the UK a lot. Or I guess in America, it would be about like a Hispanic invasion. And you just know these people often come from such like privilege, and also they don't mix with other groups of people. So in that bubble, they just get all that information from the news. So I bet a lot of these Afrikaners actually live in like completely white towns that still exist in South Africa, and they're still eating up this propaganda about being targeted by the South African government for like extermination or some shit like that. It's not a unique phenomenon to like one country, but it's clear that the whole white Western world, and I include South Africans in that because of their relation to British people and Dutch people, we've all like just gone off the deep end with this stuff. But yeah, obviously like fleeing South Africa because they feel like they're going to be persecuted is nothing new. So obviously like white Rhodesians fled to South Africa, then a lot of these types fled to Israel or Australia or Britain after apartheid ended. And it's just like the biggest victim complex. Like they obviously have the most insane logic of, I always have to live in an apartheid system or like a white supremacist nation or I can't be safe. Now, like I said, there was a good article. I don't know much about this, but it's a South African outlet called the Daily Maverick. I think it's like a liberal outlet. And a guy called Richard Poplack wrote a good article and they referenced it. I just want to read some of it for you today. So according to the UN, almost 304 million humans are on the run from the horrors of a decaying planet, be it the unkindness of their neighbours, the caprice of their rulers, or the fury of the weather itself. I've seen people inhabiting white tents in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Central African Republic, in Syria, in South Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Afghanistan, and once or twice here at home, in filthy church basements where they hide from the violence of this country. But one thing that all these disparate people have in common, a distinct lack of luggage. On Sunday evening at Johannesburg's O.R. Tambo International Airport, a cluster of 50 or so Afrikaners and their bags was spirited onto an aircraft chartered by the United States government. These were the first in a tranche of local white, supposedly farmers, granted refugee status by the Trump regime, who allege that this minority is targeted for persecution by the South African state. Make no mistake, South Africa is a violent place. The bloodshed comes suddenly, its viciousness often prompted by ancient rage and loathings. The aftermath, for those of us who've witnessed it, resembles more than the floor of a butcher shop. It comes first for the vulnerable, children and women. Next, it comes to the men, most often at each other's hands. The statistics are widely available. A disproportionate number of the victims are black and poor. The rule is simple: the less you have, the more harm you will suffer. But what the state has not done is single out a minority group for violent persecution. To allege as much, to even suggest that the government has targeted white Afrikaners, is unforgivable libel. The game is obvious: to invert the harms visited on black South Africans during apartheid, and to claim the mantle of righteous victimhood for themselves. In this narrative, the real victims of South African history are the families awaiting their chartered flight to the United States. To be sure, life is hard for everyone. It is statistically and economically less hard for whites in this country. We cannot know at this point what the faux refugees' families had suffered. What we do know is that they're just a handful among 304 million who have packed up their belongings and looked for safety and opportunity elsewhere. No other group on earth can claim such preferential treatment from the richest and most powerful country in human history. Their lobby groups whined on Twitter, and 6 months later, they were on a private plane to the US. If this isn't wildly extraordinary privilege, I don't know what is. And don't fool yourself, what Trump and his lackeys, several of whom are ex-South Africans, are trying to build is apartheid. That's the aim, so it stands to reason that these Afrikaners will feel right at home. So yeah, I like that article because it just points out the absolute absurdity of these people being even classed as refugees in the first place, but also the absurdity of them compared to other refugees. Like, most refugees don't just, pack up their bags, probably have a lot of money in their bank account and decide, I'm gonna take a private plane by the US to the United States. And it, of course, like I said before, it resembles what a lot of white Afrikaans did after the end of apartheid. They fled to Australia, they fled to Israel, they fled to places where they feel like they could still be in the powerful, racially dominant group in terms of the power structures, and they would be in a white majority. Obviously completely disgusting, because the US causes so much destruction around the world, causes so much instability around the world, causes so many refugees around the world. Just like, look at what Israel has done to Gaza and how much that is, at the direction of the US, how much the US contributes to that. And think about that in regards to like the whole of the Middle East region, the whole of Africa. But the US taking in refugees from these regions is so incredibly small, despite being responsible for it. So the US can destabilize all these regions, cause these huge refugee crises, and because of they're geographically so far away, they really don't even have to deal with these refugees, and they don't try and even help out, right? So the fact that they're going out their way to help this specific group of refugees just says absolutely everything. This video is pretty long, but I feel like it bears sharing this as well. There was an article on Reuters by Tim Cox, and I think it's important to read this just to show you like the reality of both like the interaction between white farmers who often own a lot of land that isn't even being used, right? But also what the reality is like for black farmers there still, 30 years after apartheid ended. So the stark divide that South Africa's Land Act seeks to bridge, February 10th, just after the act was signed. So I'm going to butcher this, but the township of Feteng-si-Netshu houses some 7,000 black South Africans. Its huddle of corrugated metal roofs surrounded on all sides by vast tracts of mostly empty grassland owned by prosperous white farmers. The contrast illustrates the gaping land inequalities that persists more than 3 decades after the end of white minority rule. So Feteng's local councillor, Malafetsani Mokoena, 51, spends his days mediating disputes between these landowners and black rural folk who live among them. Tall and wiry, he is usually decked out in the red uniform of his party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, which wants to nationalise the country's gold and platinum mines and seize the land from white farmers. Sometimes the white farmers don't trust me, he told Reuters in the township's 3-room brick municipal office, but when we sit down and negotiate, we can work things out. One white farmer interviewed by Reuters, Danny Brewer, confirmed that he and Mokoena were on good terms. If a farmer has a sheep stolen, Mokoena finds the thief to get it back. A black herder has his cows impounded for trespassing on the white-owned land, Mokoena negotiates their release. And as with the 15 other farms in his caseload, if Mokoena calls farm dwellers, squatters legally speaking, face eviction or restrictions on their rights to graze animals, he finds them legal representation. The mostly white-owned farms around here, among the nearly 26 million hectares, about 3/4 of privately owned land, still in the hands of whites, who make up 8% of the population, only 4% of privately held land is owned by black people, who are nearly 80% of South Africa's 60 million population. On one white-owned farm, 57-year-old herder Shadrach Maseko surveyed an expanse of the hilly pasture stretching to the horizon. He complained of how it had been fenced off for a decade by a new white owner to prevent cattle owned by black South Africans grazing on it. Maseko's grandparents came here in the early 1900s to seek work as farmhands, he told Reuters. The family had been there ever since, he said. His father, who died 2 years ago, was born here, as was Maseko. This is home. Even some of our ancestors are buried here. He said while previous owners had been happy for them to work there, in the past decade him and 14 families living there have been in disputes with the latest white owners over grazing rights for their 30 cows. And for many black people, disputes like these reflect a legacy of inequality left by the colonial and apartheid eras, when they were dispossessed of their land and denied property rights. In 1913, a Native Land Act gave most farmland to whites, mostly Afrikaners of Dutch descent, leaving just 13% to the blacks. And then in 1950, the Afrikaner National Party passed a law removing 3.5 million black people from their ancestral lands. While 30 years of ANC government has created a class of super rich black businessmen, it has done little for the poor majority. So I read all of that just to illustrate the point that the people who suffer most in South Africa and the people at the bottom of society are black South Africans still to this day. White South Africans still enjoy immense privilege in this regard. They still disproportionately own a lot of the wealth. They overwhelmingly own most of the land. And the government essentially sat on their hands for 30 years and is finally trying to do something about it. And that's why this conspiracy about white South African farmers being targeted for their race has now come to the surface again, because the government are actually doing something for once. Obviously, this comes after the ANC actually lost the majority for the first time. Obviously comes with the economic freedom fighters gaining a foothold in politics, and they want to actually nationalise industries and take all of the land. So that's why they're being pressured to actually do something for once. But yeah, the lack of action by the ANC and the government since the end of apartheid means that the status quo established during apartheid has really not been eaten into. Like I said, there has been a new capitalist class of black businessmen, and obviously there is more economic mobility, but overwhelmingly the poorest in society are still black people, and white people still own all this land, which obviously keeps black farmers and people in rural areas in increasing poverty. So if there's anyone who should be accepted as a refugee into America in South Africa, you would say it's the poorest in society, which is usually black people in rural areas, but I don't think there's going to be a private jet coming for them anytime soon. So that is the short of it. Please don't even entertain the propaganda, and it just shows where we're at as a society, that when I read the mainstream press articles on this, like that one was pretty good. Most of them like treat it like a both sides issue, which is insane to remember a time when the press talked about this issue and saw it for what it was, a white nationalist conspiracy theory. But that's just where we're at now. The white nationalist conspiracy theory is not just being both sides by the press, it's actually embraced by the most powerful people on earth. So that's it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.